Everybody, thanks for coming today. I'm Nick Ichien, and I'm the chair of this session. I seems like we have a good quorum, so I'm going to get started. I'm also the first speaker. I'm a grad student at UCLA, and I'm going to get the session started off with a project looking at relation representation and analogical reasoning and recognition memory. So I'm going to start with a couple of observations about relation representation. It might be helpful for me to think about my car as a unified or unstructured entity, like when I'm trying to locate it in a parking lot. But if it starts to malfunction, it might be helpful for me to think about it as a structured entity, which requires representing its component parts separately from the spatial and functional relations among them so that I or my mechanic can repair it. Or when I drive, it's helpful for me to represent it as distinct from, but in relation to the other cars on the road so that I can do things like change lanes without crashing. And as people who study analogy will grasp, understanding the relation between lane closures and traffic might provide generalizable knowledge that can be applied to very different domains, like understanding how plaque buildup is related to blood clots. That all being said, relation representation is also cognitively costly. It requires dynamically binding constituent entities to intact relational structures, which motivates the question that sort of is centered in my talk. When is relation representation uniquely useful? Or conversely, when is it non-redundant? To answer this question, I'm going to model capacities for which relation concepts have been hypothesized to be necessary to account for human behavior. For example, analogical reasoning, and more recently, in a study led by Ben Popov, who showed that recognition memory is another domain in which relation concepts seem to be necessary for modeling human behavior. So to answer this question, I'm going to compare models that operate on semantic relations between lexical concepts, as well as the lexical semantics that constitute the meaning of individual words. And finally, I'm going to I'm going to compare a model that also combines the first two kinds of representations. To give you a sense of what I mean by that, all of the stimuli in this talk will involve pairs of words. And so when I talk about a model operating on semantic relations, I'm talking about a model that operates on the information in red for each of these word pairs. And then with lexical semantics, I'm talking about a model that operates on the individual word meanings that constitute each of the word pairs. So before I go into the modeling, I'm going to describe the experimental procedure that we had humans follow in order to generate performance on the different tasks. The first task that we had people complete was an encoding task in which we had people encode word pairs by seeing word pairs one at a time and asking them to judge whether the word pairs featured semantic concepts that were related in some way. So in this case, the individual word pairs featured a word pair that was indeed related, whiskers being a part of a cat. Here's another word pair that was related in the sense that a shirt is a kind of clothing. Here's a word pair that's not related. There's no discernible semantic relation between eraser and yak. And here's the fourth word pair that's related in the sense that a dress or a closet is a place for a dress. And this task involved 100 trials, 90 of which featured word pairs that were related and 10 of which were unrelated. And this task preceded a distractor task, just consisting of a visual reasoning task, some Raven's progressive matrix problems, and then a recognition memory task, in which we presented people with pairs of words and asked them just to say whether those words were old, in the sense that the individual or the combination of the words were shown during the prior encoding task. In this case, this would be an old word pair in the sense that this combination of words were shown during the relatedness task, or if they were new in the sense that the combination was not shown during the prior encoding task. So you might notice that the individual words in this task were shown during the prior encoding task, but what we're asking participants to judge is whether the combination of words were shown during the encoding task. And this task involved 54 trials, 18 of which featured old word pairs and 36 of which featured new word pairs. After this memory task, we had people complete a verbal analogy task in which we presented on each trial people with pairs of word pairs and asked people to judge whether those pairs constituted a valid analogy or not. In this case, the pair of word pairs do not constitute a valid analogy in the sense that they instantiate different semantic relations. So the correct answer on this trial would be no. On the other hand, this pair of word pairs do constitute a valid analogy in the sense that they each bear a place thing relation. And so this trial, or this task, involved 50 trials. 20 of them featured analogous relations and 23 of which featured non-analogous relations or word pairs. And this encoding task preceded another distractor task, that same set of, or different set of Raven's progressive matrix problems, as well as a new old new recognition memory task, which was formally identical to the first one, but just featured a different set of word pairs. And so in this recognition memory task, we had word pairs that were instantiating some of the relations that were shown during the prior encoding tasks, as well as a set of word pairs that instantiated a relation that participants were not exposed to during the prior encoding task. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about this distinction and how it relates to the structure of our task. So in that old new recognition task, we had, like I said before, a set of old word pairs that were just directly taken from the prior encoding task, and a set of new word pairs that were recombinations, that is, new combinations of the words that were shown during the prior encoding task. And those recombinations featured either one of 4 semantic relations or were unrelated. Just to give you a sense of each, I provided examples of the familiar relations. These are the word pairs that are new, but were instantiating relations that were shown during the prior encoding task, and that's the sense in which they're familiar. And here's a set of word pairs that feature a new relation, that similarity relation, where the individual words share a number of attributes. And then here's an example, or a set of examples of unrelated word pairs. And so for this task, we had this hypothesis that people would use relations as a cue for old new recognition, which involves the assumption that people are representing the word pairs during the encoding task in terms of the relation concepts that these word pairs fall under. So the prediction would be that more false alarms would be had on word pairs with familiar relations than those involving unfamiliar relations and those that are unrelated. And this is the same hypothesis that Van Popov and his colleagues tested in their paper. That was sort of the model for this task, or for this, yeah. And so before I go into the data on the old new recognition task that confirms or rejects this hypothesis, I'm just going to flash the results of the encoding tasks. In general, people were performing quite well on both the relatedness and the verbal analogy tasks, achieving pretty high hit rates and correct rejections on each, as well as on the memory task. There wasn't really a difference in people's performance across the 2 memory tasks, so we just combined the data here. But more importantly, what I'm going to plot here is the false alarm rate on those new word pairs, those familiar relations, those involving that unfamiliar similarity relation, and those involving unrelated word pairs. And so here we see that you have a greater false alarm rate for word pairs that are instantiating those familiar relations. Those are the relations that people were exposed to during the prior encoding task, than those involving the unfamiliar similarity relation. And in turn, the word pairs involving any sort of semantic relation, people false alarmed more on those than those involving the unrelated word pairs. And so in the next section of this talk, I'm going to present some modeling results that aim to answer the question of whether relation concepts are necessary to reproduce human performance on the verbal analogy and the old new recognition tasks. So before I talk about the results, I'm just going to briefly describe our approach to modeling. We compared models operating over 3 alternative distance measures that involve different kinds of information about these word pairs. So the relational measure involves representing the word pairs in terms of the semantic relations that they instantiate. So this measure starts with word-to-vec vectors, which are just vector representations of individual word meanings. And what we do is we transform these pairs of words to relation vectors by a model that we developed in our lab, BART. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about this model in one of the upcoming talks. But just for the purposes of this talk, all you need to know is that what BART does is it takes a pair of Word-to-Vec vectors and it transforms these into a new vector where each of the dimensions of that vector corresponds to a different semantic relation. And so that's the sense in which this model represents word pairs in terms of the semantic relations that they instantiate, or it is a relational model. And so to compute the distance, we just compute the cosine distance between the relation vectors and for one word pair from another word pair. And to give you a sense of the kind of information that this model captures, what I've done here is I've plotted individual word pairs in a T7.1 plot, just in a two-dimensional space, and I've color-coded them according to the relations that they're meant to instantiate. And so these relational vectors seem to capture pretty well the relational meaning of each of the word pairs in the sense that they discriminate between the relational categories, the category exemplar, part, whole, and place thing relations quite well. The other distance measure that we were looking at was this lexical measure, which was just directly a measure of the individual lexical semantics of each of the words constituting each word pair. To sort of implement this distance measure, what we did is we just sort of computed the cosine distance between the first word of each word pair and the second word of each word pair, and then we just averaged them. And to give you that same T7.1 plot, but using the lexical distance measure instead of the relational distance measure, I plotted that here. And you see it's a little bit rougher of a clustering of the different relational categories, but it still seems to capture the relational information that we're intending to evoke in these word pairs quite well. And so one reason why this might be the case is that lexical concepts in these word-to-vec vectors might implicitly code information about relational roles, like the fact that an animal is a superordinate category or that store tends to be a place. And so those are the two distance measures that we were comparing. And then we compared to this third distance measure that's just a sort of direct average of the two. And so we were able to model the verbal analogy performance directly from these distance measures. In order to do so, what we did was we just computed the distance between a pair of word pairs shown on a given trial and fit a threshold parameter for each model or for each distance measure. If the distance between a pair of words on a given analogy trial was below that threshold, then we would count that as the model saying that that constituted a valid analogy. And if the distance between a pair of words in a given trial was above that threshold parameter, we would say that that model is counting that pair of words as constituting an invalid analogy. And so just to remind you of overall human performance on these analogy problems, I flashed it here. And here's the overall performance of the fit models using each of the different distance measures. So the relational model is getting, on average, 75% of these problems correct, the lexical model getting 59 correct, and the joint model 65. In addition to that, what we did was computed an item level analysis in which we computed the proportion of people in our sample that rated a given item as constituting a valid analogy. And I plotted that on the y-axis of these graphs. And then on the x-axis of these graphs, what I've done is I plotted the distance between a pair of words that constitute a given analogy trial. And here you see that at the item level, the relational model is doing a bit better than the lexical and the joint models and accounting for item level human performance. With these two results, we sort of conclude with the analogical reasoning simulations that the relational model or the distance measures operating on relational information is probably the most important in sort of accounting for human-like performance on these problems. Next, in order to model old-new recognition memory, we couldn't directly take these word-to-vec or these distance measures. What we had to do was put them into a separate model. And so what we did is we try to account for human performance using Robert Nosofsky's generalized context model, which computes the probability of a given participant to rate a given word pair as old as a function of the familiarity of that word pair. And that familiarity is in turn generated as the aggregate similarity of a given word pair item I to all of the word pair items that were shown during the prior encoding task J. And then the similarity is computed as a exponential decay function, as a function of the distance between a given word pair I and a studied word pair J. And so we fit each of the different models, fit these free parameters, this criterion parameter and this memory sensitivity parameter, to best approximate human performance. And after doing that, we showed that each of these models are able to qualitatively replicate the human finding that people false alarmed more on the familiar relations than on the unfamiliar relations. And so here what we're seeing is that the lexical information, when put into this generalized context model, is capturing enough of the relational meaning of individual word pairs to be able to replicate this sort of this pattern of relation-based false alarms. In a sort of preliminary analysis, what we did was attempt to see how robust each of these distance measures were in creating this relation-based false alarm effect by tweaking the parameters, the free parameters of the generalized context model, and seeing across different variations of the parameters which of these distance measures was able to reproduce this qualitative effect more often. And so here, what I'm going to show you are sort of matrices in which the cell of each matrix, the color of each cell is going to tell you how much more likely it is for the model to rate a relationally familiar word pair as old than a relationally unfamiliar word pair. So essentially the strength of this relation-based sort of false alarm effect. And then on the y-axis is variations in the memory sensitivity parameter C, and the x-axis is variations in the criterion parameter K. And so here, all of the sort of light gray cells, the cells in which the different distance measures produce this sort of pattern of relation-based false alarms. And so here, what we're seeing is the relational distance measure is able to reproduce this pattern of results more often or across more variations in the free parameters of the generalized context model, suggesting that like when people are sort of reproducing this pattern of false alarms, it's more likely that they're operating within a representational space that codes relations explicitly than merely the lexical semantics of each individual word. And so just to summarize, relation concepts were important for simulating human-like analogical reasoning, but either relation concepts, lexical semantics, or some combination of the two could reproduce that pattern of relation-based false alarms on an old-new recognition task. But in our sort of preliminary analysis of model parameter spaces, we showed that relation concepts were more likely than the other two distance measures to generate that pattern of results. And relation concepts more likely to impact both human reasoning and recognition memory as a result. And so that's my talk. And this is the set of collaborators that have worked on this project: Kay Alfred, Sophia Baya, David Kramer, Sylvia Bungay, Hongjing Liu, and Keith Holyoke. Thank you.